wind on Old Rag does not sound like wind at all. It sounds like something dragging its knuckles across the granite, patient and slow, testing every crack in the rock for a way inside. That is what I heard first that morning, before I heard the radio call, before I saw the shape of the empty parking area at Weekly Hollow, before any of what came after. I had been sitting in my truck with a paper cup of coffee going cold in my hand, watching the fog boil up out of the hollows and settle across the base of the mountain like something breathing. 6 years I had worked this district, 6 years of pulling twisted ankles off the boulder scramble, of coaxing lost hikers off the ridgeline, of writing incident reports about squirrels chewing through packs and black bears rummaging through campsites. I thought I had seen every kind of trouble Old Rag could hand a person. I had not by a long stretch. The call came in at 7:40. Dispatch said a family had reported a son overdue from a solo overnight. He had told his father he was going up the ridge trail, camping near the summit, and coming back down the saddle trail by noon on Sunday. It was Monday morning. His truck was still in the lot at Weekly Hollow. His father had driven up from Sperryville the night before and slept in his own vehicle waiting for the boy to walk out. The father was standing at the trailhead now, and he was not moving, and the dispatcher's voice had that thin quality that told me the man had already gone somewhere in his own head that no one could reach. I put the coffee down on the dash and started the engine and drove up the fire road toward the trailhead. The trees on either side of the road were still holding the last of the autumn leaves, rust and gold and a red that looked wet in the wrong light. There was no one else on the road. I passed the ranger station and the maintenance shed and pulled in beside the father's silver pickup. He was leaning against the tailgate with his arms folded, and when I got out of my truck he looked at me the way people look at anyone in a uniform when they have run out of things to try. He said his son's name was Noconi. He said Noconi had been hiking Old Rag since he was 10 years old. He said his son knew every rock on that summit by touch, and if he was not down by noon on Sunday, then he was not coming down at all without help. I asked him the questions we always ask. What was he wearing? What color was his pack? When did you last hear from him? Did he mention meeting anyone? The father answered them all in a voice that had gone flat and careful, the way a voice goes when it is holding something back that will drown its owner if it comes out. Blue shell, gray pack, red tent. Sunday night at 8, 1 bar of signal, said he was making camp on the north side of the summit. Nobody he mentioned, nobody at all. I told him I would radio it in and start up the ridge trail. I told him to stay at the trailhead with his phone on and to call me if his son came out on his own. I did not tell him what I was already starting to think, which was that his son had not walked out because he could not walk out, and that a boy who knew Old Rag by touch does not go missing on Old Rag by accident. I did not tell him because I did not want to say it out loud yet. Saying it out loud in this district has always felt like inviting something. That is what the old caretaker who trained me used to say, and I never understood why until later. I hiked up the ridge trail with my radio on my shoulder and my pack loaded light for speed. The trail climbs steep out of the hollow, switching back through hardwoods and then opening onto the first exposed spine of granite. The wind was moving through the trees in a way I did not like. It was blowing steady and then stopping, blowing steady and then stopping, as if something upslope was breathing in and out and pulling the air with it. I have been on this mountain in every season and every weather, and I have never heard wind behave that way. It felt patterned. It felt aware. I reached the first overlook by 9:30. The valley spread out below in a soft haze. The little towns tucked into their folds of ground, the Blue Ridge going gray and blue into the distance. I stood there for a moment and listened. Nothing. No birds. That was the second thing I did not like. On a clear October morning at that elevation, there should have been juncos and chickadees and the wing sound of ravens moving between the boulders. There was nothing. Only the wind pausing and starting, and the small metallic sound of my own radio squelching once and going quiet. I keyed the mic and asked dispatch for an update. She said no other calls had come in. She said the father was still at the trailhead. She said the search and rescue team was mobilizing from the county side and would stage at the ranger station by 11. And then she said something that I had not expected. She said the family had also called in a private tracking outfit, and that outfit had already sent a crew, and the crew was requesting to meet me on the ridge at the boulder field before proceeding higher. She read me the name of the outfit twice, because the second time she said it slowly, like she wanted to be sure she had it right. Wanderer Trackers, out of Cache, Oklahoma. 10 personnel, estimated arrival at the boulder field, 10:15. I stood there on the overlook and I thought about that. A private tracking crew flown in overnight from Oklahoma, the father of a missing local boy calling in a specialist team before the sun had come up. That was not how these searches usually started. That was how they started when a family already knew what they were looking for, and knew ordinary rangers were not going to find it. I told dispatch I would meet the crew at the boulder field. I clipped the radio back onto my shoulder, and I started up the trail toward the granite, listening to the wind pause and start, and trying not to count how many seconds each pause was lasting. The trail steepened as it climbed. The trees thinned out. The bedrock came up through the soil in long gray slabs, and the moss on them was old and thick and the color of a bruise. I passed the marker for the switchback, and then the marker for the false summit, and then I came out onto the boulder field. There were 9 of them waiting for me. 9, not 10. I noted that immediately, because the count matters when you go into a search, and dispatch had said 10 personnel. They were arranged in a loose half circle at the edge of the field, at the point where the trail comes out from the trees and the granite starts. They had packs on the ground beside them. 3 of them were kneeling. 2 were standing at the tree line with their backs to me, looking up toward the summit. The rest were watching me come up the trail. They did not wave. They did not call out. They just watched, and there was something in the way they watched that made me slow my last 20 steps and come up to them at a walk rather than a hike. That was when the 10th one stepped out from behind a boulder to my left, close enough that I could have reached out and touched his sleeve, and I had not seen him at all until he moved. He was an older man, with a face weathered to leather and eyes the color of river stone. He held up one hand, palm out, and said in a quiet voice that carried further than it should have, that they had been waiting for me, and that we needed to talk before we went any further up. His name was Wanderer, and he did not offer his hand. He gestured me toward a flat spot on the granite where a canvas map had been unrolled and weighted down at the corners with fist-sized stones. The other 9 had gone back to their work. 2 were checking radios. 2 were sorting climbing gear. 1 was kneeling over a small pile of items I could not identify from where I stood, moving them with the tip of a knife. Wanderer told me to sit. I did. He told me his crew came from Cache, near the old reservation ground in Oklahoma, and that his family had been doing this work for 4 generations. He said that word, work, in a way that meant more than what he was saying. He asked me if I knew the country up here. I told him yes. He asked me if I knew the country up here at night. I told him yes. I had done winter overnights on the ridge, and I had done the summit at moonrise more times than I could count. He nodded once, slow, and said that was good. He said we would need to know the country tonight if we did not find the boy by sundown, and he said it in a way that told me he had already decided we would not find the boy by sundown. He introduced the crew one at a time, and he did it the way you introduce family members to a stranger. First and last name, and where each one came from, and what each one was good at. The lead tracker was Quahati Parker. He was in his 40s, lean, with hands that looked like they had been folded around rifle stocks and rope for a long time. He was the one who had been kneeling over the small pile of items. He raised his eyes to me when Wanderer said his name, and I saw that his left eye did not quite move with the right one. He nodded and went back to his work. The second was Peta Nocona. He was younger than Parker, maybe 35, and he did not speak, but I noticed his hands. His hands never stopped moving. He was tying and untying a length of paracord as Wanderer spoke, and the knots he was making were not the kind of knots you learn from a manual. They were older than that. The third was Buffalo Hump. That was what Wanderer called him, and none of the others corrected the name, so I took it as his. He was the oldest man on the crew, maybe 70, and he was sitting on a stone with his hands resting on his knees and his eyes closed. He did not open them when he was introduced. He only lifted his chin an inch and let it fall again. Wanderer said Buffalo Hump had been on more of these than the rest of them combined, and that when Buffalo Hump said we should go home, we should already be walking. Wanderer took me through the rest of them in turn. Ishatai, the one who had been sorting the small items with the knife, whom Wanderer called their reader of ground and reader of sky both, and whom none of the others looked at directly for very long. Tabananica, who kept the maps and the compass and the count of hours, a woman about my age with a face that gave nothing away. Yamparika, the youngest of the three scouts, quick and thin and always slightly ahead of any conversation, already looking up the slope while Wanderer was still speaking. Coetti, the second young one, a boy of maybe 22, who was here on his first crew, and whose eyes kept moving from face to face as if trying to memorize what a working expression looked like. Queenai, a wiry small man in his 50s whom Wanderer described only as their veteran, and whose right hand was missing the last two fingers. Wanderer said the 10th of them, who was still standing at the tree line with his back to us and had not turned around when I came up, was called Wanderer as well. He said it as if it were a joke that had stopped being a joke a long time ago, and no one on the crew smiled. I understood, though I did not understand then how I understood, that the man at the tree line was some kind of shadow or twin or role rather than a person exactly, and that his job on this mountain was to face outward while the rest of us faced in. Wanderer told me to look at the map. I looked at it. It was hand-drawn on canvas, and it was of Old Rag Mountain, but it was not any old rag I had seen before. The trails I knew were on it, but they were thin lines. The lines that were thick and heavy were different. They followed the ridges and the folds of stone in a pattern I did not recognize. Wanderer put his finger down on a spot that on my Park Service maps would have been the north face below the summit, about half a mile off any marked trail. He said, "This is where the boy is." He said it flat, without any doubt in his voice, the way you say a thing that you have already checked twice. I asked him how he knew. He looked at me for a long moment and then he said, "Because that is where they always are, when the wind moves the way it is moving today." He did not explain what he meant by they, and I did not ask, because at that point I was still trying to hold on to the idea that I had come out here to look for a lost hiker, and I could feel that idea starting to slip. Before we started up, he said one more thing. He said that if I stayed with the crew, I would follow the crew's instructions, not my own, and not the Park Service's, and not anyone's I might reach on the radio. He said this was not because he did not respect my uniform. It was because the last 5 Rangers who had gone up in weather like this without listening had not come back down. I asked him if he was serious. He said he was as serious as he had ever been about anything in his life. I keyed my radio. I told dispatch I was joining the private crew and would report in every hour. I did not tell her what I had just been told. If you are watching this and you are still with me, do me one small kindness. Hit the subscribe if you have not, and drop a comment telling me where you would draw the line, the point at which you would have turned around and walked back down that mountain and left the search to someone else. I know where mine is now. I did not know it then. Wanderer stood up. He rolled the canvas map and slid it into a leather tube on his pack. He looked at the sky once. He looked at Buffalo Hump once. Buffalo Hump opened his eyes and shook his head slowly. Wanderer's jaw tightened. He turned to the crew and lifted 2 fingers and made a small circle in the air, and every one of them was on their feet inside of 3 seconds, packs shouldered, hands empty and ready. We started up the trail toward the boulder scramble, and the wind did the pause and start thing again. And this time, when I counted the seconds of the pause, I got to 14 before the wind came back. The boulder scramble on Old Rag is the section that turns casual hikers into people who have opinions about mountains for the rest of their lives. It is not technical climbing. It does not require ropes, but it requires you to lower yourself feet first into cracks in the granite, to squeeze sideways between slabs that press against your chest and your back at the same time, to hoist yourself up onto ledges you cannot see the top of, and to trust that on the far side of each slab there is more mountain and not empty air. There is a rhythm to it once you have done it a few times. Your body learns which handholds to reach for and which to leave alone. Your eyes learn where the slick spots are before your feet find them. It becomes almost like a dance, if the dance were being done on a stage that had no railing and a 2,000-foot drop on the wrong side. That morning, the rhythm was gone. I felt it the second I stepped onto the first big slab. The rock felt wrong under my hands. Not slick, not loose, just wrong. Like the granite was holding still because something told it to and would go back to moving as soon as I looked away. I told myself I was imagining it. Then I saw that Yamparica, who was ahead of me by 20 feet and moving fast, had stopped in the middle of a slab and was standing there with his palm flat against the stone and his head tilted to one side, and I understood that he felt it too. Tabananatica came up beside me. She was the map keeper. She had a small leather notebook clipped to her chest strap and a pencil on a lanyard. She glanced at me and said, "We are on the older trail now." I asked her what she meant. She said, "This trail is old. It runs under the trail you know. It is on our map. It is not on yours." She did not slow down while she said any of this. She kept moving up the slab, one hand touching the stone every few steps, her eyes on the joins between the rocks. Ishitai was moving somewhere behind us. I did not see him for the next 20 minutes. When I did see him again, he was up on a boulder to our left, above the trail, doing something with a small bundle of what looked like dried grass and thin sticks. He was arranging them in a pattern on the flat top of the stone. He would place one, step back, look at it, adjust it, and then look up the slope. He did this 3 times while I watched. Each time he looked up the slope, the wind stopped, and each time he looked back down at his bundle, the wind started again. I watched this happen, and I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature settle across the back of my neck. We climbed. The scramble went on. My radio squelched twice and then went silent, and when I keyed the mic and asked dispatch for a check, I got nothing back. Not static, not the dead air of a bad frequency, nothing. As if I had keyed a mic that was not attached to anything. Kainai saw me tap the radio and said, quietly, "Save the battery. It is not going to hear you up here until we come back down." He said it the way you tell someone that the bakery has closed for the day. He kept moving. At the top of the scramble is a small saddle where the trail comes out of the boulders and runs along a spine of granite before making the last push to the summit. That was where we saw the first sign. It was Quahati Parker who called us to it. He had gone off trail by about 20 feet to check a gap between 2 slabs, and he came back with something pinched between his thumb and forefinger. He held it up. It was a tuft of hair, coarse and dark red-brown, about the length of my little finger. He turned it slowly in the sunlight. He asked me if I had ever seen a black bear leave hair like that. I told him no. Bear hair is finer and lies flatter. This was thicker. It was more like the hair on the back of a horse's neck, if the horse had been sleeping outdoors for a long time. He put it into a small tin from his pocket. He said, "That is the second sign." I asked him what the first had been. He said, "The wind." He walked away toward the rest of the crew before I could ask him what he meant. We moved along the saddle. Buffalo Hump was walking behind me now, and he was walking in a way I had not noticed before. His feet were coming down flat and quiet, and his eyes were not on the ground in front of him. His eyes were on the trees at the edge of the trail, and they were moving from one tree to the next in a pattern that was not random. He was watching the gaps between the trunks. He was watching the places where a thing might stand between 2 trees and be almost the same shape as the trees. I felt myself starting to do it too. Once you notice a gaze like that on someone else, your own eyes learn it. I found that I was scanning the gaps as I walked. I found that I did not want to look at any one gap for too long, in case it was the gap where the shape was, and in case the shape did not want to be seen yet. Yamparica came back down the trail toward us at a jog. He said something to Wanderer in a language I did not know, and Wanderer's face closed. Wanderer motioned us all up the saddle to the small clearing where the trail split, one branch going to the summit and the other cutting off toward the north face. There, at the split, half hidden by a rhododendron, was a red nylon tent. It was Nakoni's tent. The color was right. The size was right. It was pitched neatly, with the guy lines still tensioned properly, on a flat spot the boy had clearly chosen with care. The door was zipped closed. There were no drag marks in the soil around it. There was no sign of struggle. There was no pack outside. Tabananica was already opening her notebook. Quahati Parker was crouched next to the tent, reading the ground with his eyes. Ishitai was standing off to one side, not looking at the tent at all, looking at the space above it. Wanderer put his hand on my shoulder and stopped me before I could go closer. He said, "Before we open that door, I need you to understand something." He said that whatever we found inside, it was not going to answer the question we came here to ask. It was going to change the question. Quahati Parker opened the tent. He did not use the zipper on the door. He cut the far wall of the tent with a small blade, from the top down to the bed of the tent, in one long, clean stroke that made almost no sound. He said it was easier to read a tent that had been opened from a side it was not expecting to be opened from. The nylon peeled back like the skin of a fruit. Inside the tent, the sleeping bag was still zipped. It was laid out neatly along the floor of the tent, and it was empty, and it was zipped all the way to the top from the inside. That is what took me longest to understand. The zipper had been pulled up to the neck of the bag by someone whose hands had been inside the bag, not outside it. There was a small hollow in the pillow of clothes at the head, where a head had rested. There was a folded map on the ground beside the bag with a pencil laid across it at a diagonal. There was a headlamp beside the map, still switched on, the battery long dead. Nakoni had gone to sleep in that bag. He had zipped himself in. He had switched off his headlamp, or someone had switched it off for him. And then he had not been there anymore. There was no tear in the bag. There was no gap in the door zip. The far wall that Parker had just cut had been untouched before we arrived. Quahati Parker read the ground around the tent for the better part of an hour. He walked in slow concentric circles, wider each time, his eyes on the leaf litter and the moss and the small patches of exposed soil. He did not speak. Peta Nokona followed him at a distance of about 10 feet, walking in the same circles but in the opposite direction, so that between the two of them nothing on the ground escaped a set of eyes. While they read, Ishatai did something I have thought about a lot since. He walked around the tent 3 times, sunwise. Each time he passed the entrance, he stopped and set down one of the small items I had seen him sorting earlier at the boulder field. Each item was smaller than a walnut. Each was placed with great care. After the 3rd circle, he stood with his back to the tent and faced downslope, into the wind, and said something under his breath. The wind, which had been pausing and starting all morning, stopped completely and did not start again for perhaps 90 seconds. And in that 90 seconds, from somewhere upslope of us on the north face, we heard a sound. It was not a call. It was not a howl. It was not any of the sounds you have heard on a recording. It was more like a person clearing their throat, but slower and lower, and made from a chest that was not the size of a human chest. It came once. It did not repeat. Every member of the crew stopped moving. Buffalo Hump, who had been sitting cross-legged on a stone with his eyes closed again, opened them slowly and looked at Wanderer. Wanderer looked at Ishatai. Ishatai turned around and looked at the tent and then at me. He walked over and stood in front of me. He was older than I had thought at first, closer to 60 than 50, and his eyes were the light brown of old honey. He asked me, in a voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear it, if I had told the boy's father where the son was camping. I told him I had. He asked me if I had said it out loud, standing beside the truck, at the trailhead. I told him yes. He asked me if the wind had been blowing at the time. I said I did not remember. He looked at me for a long time, and then he stepped back and said only, "Next time, do not." Coetti, the young one, was standing near me while this happened. His face had gone the color of chalk. He looked at me, and then he looked away, and his mouth was trembling. I realized he was younger than I had first thought too. Maybe not 22, maybe 18. Maybe this was not just his first crew. Maybe this was his first anything of this kind. He was holding on to the strap of his pack the way a child holds onto a hand. Queen I came over to Coetti and said something to him in that language I did not know. Coetti nodded. Queen I kept his hand on the boy's shoulder for a moment and then took it away and went back to whatever he had been doing before, which was checking the edges of a knife he had drawn out of a sheath on his hip. The knife was old. The blade was of a dull metal I could not name, and had a bevel that was not machine ground. I did not know blades well enough to say what it was, but I knew it was older than any of us standing on that ridge. Yampakra had been sent up the North Face Trail to scout ahead. That was 35 minutes before we heard the throat-clearing sound. He had been due back in 20. I noticed the time on my watch, because everyone else had stopped speaking, and the numbers on my watch were the only thing that seemed to be behaving normally. Tabernanica made a small mark in her notebook. She said, out loud but not to anyone in particular, "Yamparika is 15 over." Wanderer nodded. He said to Peta Nocona, "Take Coetti and go up the North Face Trail to the first switchback. Do not go past it. Whistle back on the count of 200. If we do not hear the whistle, do not come looking." They went. They were gone for exactly the time it took to walk to the switchback and back. They came back at a fast walk. Peta Nocona did not say anything. Coetti was crying quietly, the way people cry when they have been trained to be silent and have not entirely learned it yet. Peta Nocona held out his hand. On his palm was a boot. It was a hiking boot, brown leather, the laces still tied. The laces were tied neatly and were not torn. The boot ended at the top of the ankle, where the collar had been cleanly cut off. There was no blood on the boot. There was no foot in it. There was, at the bottom of the boot, tucked down where the toes would have been, a small folded piece of paper. Wanderer took the paper. He unfolded it. He read it. He handed it to me without a word. It was a page from Tabernanica's notebook. It had been torn out from the back, along the perforation. On it, in Tabernanica's handwriting, was written the sentence, "Do not come after me." I recognized her writing because I had watched her make her mark about the time only minutes before. She had not torn a page from her notebook. She had not written those words. She had been standing beside me the entire time. Tabernanica took the paper from me and looked at her own handwriting. Her hand was steady. Her face did not change. She turned to Wanderer, and she said, "We are already inside the ring." The ring, Buffalo Hump explained to me while the rest of the crew moved into positions I did not understand, was a boundary that a certain kind of creature draws around the ground it has chosen. The ring is not always visible. It is not always the same size. It moves with the creature and stays with the creature and can close on you before you know it has opened. He said this while sitting on the same stone he had been on before, and while I sat on a stone across from him because Wanderer had told me to. Wanderer had said Buffalo Hump would tell me what I needed to know, and that I should listen and not interrupt. The rest of the crew was arranging our packs into a small pile at the center of the clearing, roping them together, and drawing lines on the ground around them with a red powder that Ishitai kept in a leather pouch. Buffalo Hump spoke slowly. His voice was low. He said that his people had a name for the thing that made the ring, and he said the name, but he said it once, in his own tongue, and then he told me not to say it out loud on this mountain. He said the English word for it, that hunters and hikers used now, was a small word that did not do the thing justice, but I could think of that word if it helped me place what he was describing. Big. Foot. He said the word, and then he made a small sound that was almost a laugh, but had no humor in it. He said the name of a thing changes the thing, over time. He said the name that his people used had not changed the thing, because his people had known better than to say it often. The other name, the small one, had been said so often now that the thing had begun to grow into it. That was how he put it. Grow into it. He said that they had come to Old Rag this time not because the family had called them, but because their people had known this mountain was one of the mountains. There were mountains, he said, that were the same mountain even when they had different names and stood in different states. Old Rag was one of them. The land beneath the surface did not care about the maps we had drawn on top. The creatures who lived beneath the surface did not care either. He said that his own great-grandfather had walked this ridge when it was still called by an older name, and had left a piece of his own hair tied to a certain rhododendron somewhere on the north face, so that when a member of his line came back, the ground would know them. He said Ishitai had found the hair that morning, still tied, still in place, only a little sun-bleached, 140 years after it was tied. He said it as if it were an ordinary thing. His eyes were closed while he said it. He said the creature took people who were sleeping alone. It did not take people who were awake. It did not take people who were in groups of 3 or more. It took people who were sleeping alone, and it took them clean, and it left the sleeping bag zipped, because that was what it did. That was one of the rules. There were rules. Every kind of thing had rules. If you knew the rules, sometimes you could live, sometimes you could not. He said the boy Nakoni had not made a mistake. The father had made a mistake. The father had let the boy come up here alone at this time of year, when the wind moved this way, and the father had known the story and had let him come anyway, because the father had not believed the story. And now the father was standing at the trailhead of a mountain that had swallowed his son, and he had begun to believe. He said Yemparika was gone, not lost. Gone. The boot on the ground was not a warning to us. It was an inventory. The creature was showing us what it had taken. That was another of the rules. He said the paper in the boot was not written by the creature. It was written by the ground. The ground here had a memory, and the memory could write things, and what the memory wrote came out in whatever hand was closest to it. Tabananica had been the closest to it, so her hand had come out on the page. I asked him what the message meant. He looked at me and said, "It means what it says. Do not come after him." Yamparika chose to go up the north face because he saw a track and thought he could get out ahead of it. He did not get out ahead of it. He went past the ring. He will not be coming back to us as Yamparika. There is a chance he will come back to us as something else, and if he does, we will need to be ready. I felt something cold pass through me at that. I do not know how else to describe it. Not the cold of temperature, the cold of a possibility. Buffalo Hump stood up. He looked at the sky. It was mid-afternoon, and the sun was going, and clouds were coming in from the west, thick and low. He said the wind was going to stop soon and not start again until after nightfall. He said when the wind stopped for the long stop, we needed to be inside Stone. He said Stone remembered older things than the ring did, and the older things were on our side, sometimes. Sometimes. We moved. We went off the trail to the west, following Wanderer, and Wanderer moved through the boulder field without touching the marked trail once. He knew a path I did not. It went under overhangs I had walked past 100 times and never looked at. It went through slots between boulders I had never noticed. It came out at the base of a granite shelf where the mountain formed a natural half-cave, open at the front, roofed by a single slab of stone 12 feet above our heads and 30 feet across. Wanderer told us this was where we would spend the night. He told us we would not build a fire. He told us we would not use white light after sundown. He told us we would tie ourselves loosely together at the wrist with a length of paracord so that no one of us could be pulled away in silence. He told me to sit against the back wall of the shelter and to face outward, and to keep my hands where I could see them. I asked why. He said because when it came to the mouth of the shelter, it would try to talk. He said it would use the voice of someone I knew. He said if I answered, I would break the ring inward, and then it would be inside with us. He said the only thing to do was to keep my hands where I could see them, so that when it used a voice I loved, I would not stand up before I knew what I was doing. I did what he said. I sat with my back against the granite. I watched the light bleed out of the sky, and I waited. The wind stopped at 6:27 in the evening. I know, because I looked at my watch and read the numbers and put my hands back on my knees because Wanderer had told me to keep them where I could see them. The stop was not gradual. It did not fade. It ended in the middle of a gust, like a switch had been thrown, and the silence that took its place was so heavy that my ears rang. The 9 of them arranged themselves in the shelter without speaking. Quinai and Peta Nokona took the 2 front corners, facing outward, with their old blades resting across their knees. Quahati Parker took the mouth of the shelter, sitting cross-legged in the exact middle, blocking any straight line into the interior. Tabananica took the position beside me at the back wall, her notebook open on her lap, though the light was going and I could not see how she planned to write. Eshatai took the position directly opposite Quahati Parker, sitting cross-legged against the back wall a few feet from me, with the leather pouch of red powder in his lap and his hands resting on top of it. Buffalo Hump took the position beside Wanderer, and Wanderer sat at the very front lip of the shelter with his legs dangling out over the drop, looking down into the gathering gloom of the ridge. Coetti sat between Quinai and me. His shoulders were touching mine. He was still breathing shallow and fast, like a bird held in a hand. I asked, in a whisper, what happened to Yamparika? Tabananica did not turn her head. She said, in a whisper of her own, keep your hands where you can see them. The last of the light went. It did not go slowly. The sky above the ridge went from gray to a lightless gray so gradually that I could not put a finger on the moment it changed. And then all at once, the shape of Wanderer at the mouth of the shelter was only a silhouette against a slightly less lightless sky, and then it was not even that. I sat there in the black with my hands on my knees and I listened. The first sound was a stick breaking. It was not close. It was maybe 100 feet downslope. The break was clean. That is what caught me. A stick that breaks under an animal's weight snaps in a soft way, because the animal shifts on it. A stick that breaks in a clean single crack has been broken by a hand. I heard the sound and I understood that whatever was outside the shelter was not stepping on sticks by accident. It was breaking them to be heard. The second sound was a whistle. A single low whistle, the kind Yamparika had made when he had signaled the crew earlier in the day. It came from the same distance as the stick. It was pitched slightly wrong. It was too low. Yamparika's whistle had been higher. I felt Coetti tense beside me. He drew in a small breath. I felt Quinai's arm come across in front of him, hand flat on his chest, holding him against the back wall. Coetti did not move. The third sound was a voice. It said the name of the boy who had gone missing. Nokoni. It said it once. It said it in a voice that was almost right. It said it in the voice of the boy's father, but with a small quality underneath that voice, a second voice that was moving inside the first the way a tongue moves inside a mouth. It said the name, and then it waited. I felt my throat begin to close. The father's voice had said the name over and over that morning at the trailhead. The father's voice had said the name to me while I stood beside my truck, and the wind had blown steady past us then and I had not thought anything of it. I understood, sitting there in the black, what Ishitai had asked me about the wind. I understood what he had meant when he had said, "Next time, do not." The voice came again. It said my name. It said my name in the voice of my own father. My father had died 4 years ago in a house on the edge of Madison County, of a heart he had known was failing and had not spoken about. My father's voice said my name from the trees below the shelter, and it said it in the tone he had used when I was small and had wandered too far into the yard, and it said it as if he were waiting for me to come. I did not move. I felt my knees begin to shake. I kept my hands where I could see them, even though I could not see them, because I had been told to. That was the only thing that kept me sitting there, not knowing why, only that Wanderer had said, only that the older man at the front of the shelter, whose silhouette I could no longer make out, had told me. Ishitai began to sing. He sang in a low voice that was under the voice from the trees, weaving under it. A line of sound in a language I did not know that seemed to catch the other voice and hold it and slow it. The voice from the trees said my name again, more slowly, and its tone was changing. It was becoming less like my father and more like something else. The second voice underneath was coming up through the first now. It was rising. It was the voice of a chest that was not the size of a human chest, and it was almost laughing. Something came up onto the shelf outside the shelter. I did not see it. I heard it. Its weight was very great. Its feet were very quiet. It stopped at the mouth of the shelter where Wanderer sat. It stood there for what felt like a long time. Wanderer spoke to it. He spoke to it in the tongue of the crew, low and even. He said something to it in a tone that was not fear, and was not challenge, and was not welcome. It was the tone of someone speaking to a family member with whom there has been an old and terrible disagreement. I could not understand the words. I understood the shape of them. He was asking it to leave what it had already taken, and to take nothing more tonight. The thing at the mouth of the shelter answered. It did not use words. It made a sound that was almost the throat-clearing sound we had heard on the ridge, but longer and shaped. There was a rhythm to it. There was a phrase in it. Buffalo Hump answered on Wanderer's other side. He spoke very softly. He named a thing. He named a place. He named a year. I could not understand any of it, but I felt the shape of it in my chest, the shape of a very old debt being called. The thing at the mouth of the shelter went quiet. Then it moved. I heard the weight of it shift. I heard the stone under it creak once, though I would not have believed granite could creak until that night. And then I heard it move away, not back down the slope, sideways, around the shelter, along the shelf, until the sound of it was gone. Ishitai stopped singing. Wanderer said, very quietly, keep your hands where you can see them until sunrise. We sat like that all night. No one slept. No one spoke. The wind did not start again until the first gray of dawn began to show at the mouth of the shelter, and then it started slowly, gently, like it had been given permission. At dawn we came out. Wanderer was still in his position at the front. Buffalo Hump was still beside him. Queen Eye and Pita no Kono were still at the corners with their old blades. Coeti was still beside me, and he was alive, and his eyes were dry now, but they had a distance in them that I did not think would ever completely leave. Kwahadi Parker was gone. His spot at the mouth of the shelter was empty. His pack was still against the wall. His blade was still on the ground where he had been sitting. The paracord that had loosely bound our wrists together was still tied to the loop on his pack, and it was still tied at his end, but there was no wrist inside the loop. The knot was closed on nothing. It had been closed on nothing for hours, and none of us had felt it come free. Wanderer looked at the knot for a long time. He did not touch it. Buffalo Hump put a hand on his shoulder. Wanderer nodded, once, and stood up. We walked down off the mountain in a line, and Yamparika was not with us, and Kwahadi Parker was not with us, and the boy Nakoni was not with us. We came out at the boulder field where I had first met the crew, and we walked down the ridge trail, and my radio came back on somewhere near the last overlook with a burst of static that made me flinch. Dispatch was frantic. I told her I was coming down. I did not tell her more than that. Not yet. At the trailhead, the boy's father was still there. He was sitting on the tailgate of his silver pickup. He had not moved. He looked at us as we came down out of the trees, all 9 of us where he had watched 11 go up, and he did not need to ask any questions. His face folded in and did not come back out. Wanderer went to him and sat beside him on the tailgate and spoke to him for a long time. I did not hear what was said. Buffalo Hump stood at a small distance with his hands folded in front of him. The rest of the crew loaded their packs into a van that had arrived from Cache while we had been on the mountain. No one asked me any questions. No one gave me any papers to sign. They finished loading, and Wanderer came back to me and gripped my forearm once and said, quietly, if the wind ever stops that way again, do not go up. He said it as a favor. He said it as a warning. He said it as the last thing he was going to say to me, and it was. They drove away. I filed a report. In the report I said that the missing hiker Nakoni had not been located, that his tent had been found and secured, and that a private crew from Cache, Oklahoma had assisted in the search. I said one member of the private crew had also gone missing during the search and had not been located. I did not use the name Kwahadi Parker in the report because Wanderer had asked me not to, and I have kept that promise. I said the search was suspended pending further information. That was 2 years ago. I still work this district. I still walk this ridge. I no longer take overnight camping calls in the fall when the wind starts to pause. I have not heard the throat-clearing sound again. I do not go up to the shelter under the shelf. I do not say the name of the creature. I do not say the name of my father out loud on the mountain. Sometimes, on a still evening, when the light is going and I am closing up the ranger station and there is no wind at all, I hear a sound down the fire road that could be a stick breaking or could be a boot on gravel, and I stop what I am doing and I keep my hands where I can see them, and I wait for the sound to go past. It always does, so far. If you have made it with me to the end of this, I would like to know something. Down in the comments, tell me one place where you would not spend a night alone, and why you would not. I read them. I read all of them. I have started keeping a list. And do me one more small kindness if this story stayed with you. Hit the like, share it with someone who thinks the country outside town is empty, and follow along, because the country is not empty, and there is more of it to walk through. The wind is starting up the ridge again as I write this. It is pausing, and starting, and pausing, and starting. I am going to close the window now. Every ranger who has served long enough in the New River Gorge learns to know one particular sound. Not the roar of the whitewater 60 meters below, not the whistle of autumn wind through the pine boughs on the ridge. Something else. something older. And on the night of October the 11th, I heard it 3 separate times. The first time was at Long Point Overlook. I was leaning on the wooden railing, hands wrapped around a steel travel mug, watching the sun break itself apart against the sandstone cliffs. The gorge does not simply go dim at dusk, it swallows the light. The stone throats of the canyon draw the last color of day down into themselves, the way water spins into a drain. I have watched this happen many hundreds of times across the 11 years I have worn this uniform. The badge on my chest reads New River Gorge National Park and Preserve. My hat sat beside me on the railing that evening, brim upturned, because I wanted to feel the cold on the crown of my head. I wanted to feel awake. I had a bad feeling about the coming night. The sound rose. It was neither hoot nor howl nor call. It came up out of the canyon like a note played through a bone flute in a room full of water. Long, low, deliberate. The second time was inside my patrol vehicle on the fire road that runs along the eastern rim. The radio clipped at my shoulder had crackled 20 minutes earlier. Dispatch reported that a visitor had failed to check back in at the trailhead register, and his car remained parked in the lot at Kmore. The name on the registration was Cayetano. He was a solo hiker, 43 years old, experienced. He had told the rangers on duty that morning that he intended to walk down the miner's staircase, take photographs of the coke ovens at the bottom, and return by 4 in the afternoon. It was now approaching 7. I heard the sound again through the rolled-up window. It rose through the trees along the rim and passed through the metal of my vehicle, as if the metal offered no resistance at all. The third time, I was standing in front of the small cinder block station at Sandstone, holding a printout of Cayetano's face, and the paper trembled in my hand although the air had gone entirely still. The sound came from behind me, from the tree line, from the direction of the gorge, and this time I understood what had bothered me from the first note. It did not echo. In a canyon that deep, in a canyon carved by one of the oldest rivers on this continent, every sound bounces and returns and answers itself. Raindrops echo, loose stones echo, your own bootsteps echo. But this call did not. It simply stopped, as though the gorge had opened a wide mouth to receive it and closed the mouth again. I put the printout inside a manila envelope. I walked back to the vehicle. I called for backup on the encrypted channel we use for search and rescue. Then I drove down the fire road toward Kmore with a knot in the pit of my stomach that no ranger training had ever taught me how to loosen. Cayetano's car was a small silver sedan, dusted with pollen and yellow leaves. The doors were locked. The dash was empty. Through the windshield I could see a pack of chewing gum on the passenger seat and a paperback book with a bird on the cover. Beside the vehicle, the trailhead board displayed the day's register. Cayetano had signed in at 9:17 in the morning. He had drawn a small mark shaped like an arrow beside his name. In the intended return column he had written 4 p.m. The line beside returned was blank. I crossed to the head of the miner's staircase. 821 steps dropped from that point down into the gorge, following the old coal transportation grade. The steps were built after the mines closed, so that visitors could reach the ruins at the bottom in safety. I have descended them in every weather. I know each landing by heart. I know where the poison ivy grows and where the copperheads sun themselves in July. I know where the second cliff face looks like a face. I switched on my headlamp, although the light of the sky above the ridge was still enough to walk by. Then I began the descent. At the 4th landing, I found the first thing that made me stop. A trail marker post at the edge of the wooden platform had been broken. Not knocked over, not weathered down. Snapped, at a point roughly 2 meters up from the platform floor. The break was fresh. The pale interior wood was still bright as new pine. I estimated the marker post at 8 inches thick. To snap it at that height, a person would need to reach up above their head and apply lateral force in the direction of the gorge. No person I have ever met could apply that much lateral force. I stood there with the beam of my headlamp playing across the fresh break, and I began to notice that the ordinary sounds of the forest at dusk had ceased. No cicadas, no katydids, no little owl at the ridgetop. Just my own breathing, and, somewhere far down at the river, a splash that was too heavy to be a fish. If you are still listening to me by the end of this account, and you find yourself moved by these events, please take a moment before you continue to leave a comment on this channel, to press the small heart button, and to subscribe. It will take a few seconds only. It will help keep these stories reaching those who need to hear them. I placed a small orange flag beside the broken marker post to indicate the position for the incident report. Then I did what any ranger with proper training would do. I called for backup a second time, and I waited for my partner to descend behind me. His name was Barboncito. He was already on the fire road, 6 minutes out. Barboncito reached the head of the staircase 8 minutes after I first radioed him. I heard the sound of his boots on the wooden steps above me before I saw the beam of his headlamp break through the hemlock branches. He came down with the quiet efficiency I had learned to expect from him. He never rushed. He never wasted a movement. Yet he arrived at any scene faster than rangers who ran. He had served as a ranger for 7 years. Before that, he had spent a decade as a fire watch officer in the desert country of northern Arizona, where his family had lived for generations. He wore his hair long and tied at the base of the neck under his hat. He carried his personal knife in a sheath at his belt beside the standard issue radio. On his left wrist was a woven leather band that his grandmother had made for him. He did not speak much. When he did speak, other rangers listened. He stopped at the 4th landing beside the broken marker post. He examined the fresh break without touching it. He knelt and passed his fingertips lightly across the surface of the wooden platform, gathering something. He held his hand up to my headlamp beam. Coarse dark strands lay across his glove. They were not human hair. They were not the fur of any deer or bear I could name. They were longer than the leg hair of an elk, and they were rough, like the guard hairs of a very old bison. There were 3 strands. All 3 had been drawn against the wood at a height too great for any 4-legged animal in the eastern forests. "You bagged the flag position?" Barboncito asked. "Yes." He took a small clear bag from his chest pocket. He placed the hairs inside. He labeled the bag with a black marker. He looked down the remaining flights of steps toward the river. "You called Manuelito?" "He is in Denver," I said. "Some interagency training. But I sent him the incident summary. He will call back within the hour," Barboncito said. He was right. Manuelito was the closest thing to a father the Ranger Service had given me during my early years. He had trained me in the interpretation of animal sign, in the geology of the gorge, and in the older knowledge that Ranger academies do not put into the curriculum. He had retired to a supervisory role in the region 3 years ago, but he remained the person I called when a situation did not fit any of the ordinary categories. I had learned very quickly that whenever I sent a summary that made him uneasy, he called me back within 1 hour, sometimes within 15 minutes. Barboncito and I continued the descent. We passed the 5th landing, the 6th. We shone our beams across the wooden handrails, along the packed earth of the trail edges, into the gaps between the steps. We spoke very little. Both of us knew what we were doing. We were looking for the pattern. At the 7th landing, we found the second pattern. A hemlock branch as thick as my forearm had been snapped from the trunk of a tree about 4 meters off the trail. It had been torn downward, not out. The interior wood was pale. Sap still glistened at the break, but the branch itself was gone. Not fallen to the ground, not resting nearby, simply not present. Somebody, or something, had removed it from the location. Below the tree, the leaf litter had been disturbed. Not in the pattern of any bear pawing for grubs. Not in the pattern of a wild pig rooting for tubers. The disturbance was a long, shallow depression, roughly 3 meters in length, wider at one end than the other, as if a heavy body had knelt or lain and pressed itself into the loam. At the wider end, where the shoulders would have been if this had been a body, the leaf litter carried 5 deep impressions. 5 deep, wide, human-shaped impressions. Barboncito photographed them with the Ranger camera. I placed a measuring tape. The palm to fingertip length was 32 centimeters. "A man's hand from wrist to fingertip is around 18, Barboncito said quietly. He did not sound afraid. He did not sound surprised. He sounded like a person watching a film he had already seen once before. My radio crackled. It was Manuelito. "Turn back," he said. There was no other greeting. No other explanation. "Sir?" "Turn back," he repeated. Now, bring Barboncito with you. Set no more flags. Take no more photographs. Get to the top of the staircase. I am putting a specialized team in the air. They will land at the Sandstone airfield in 4 hours. They know what they are doing. Barboncito had come to my shoulder to listen. He did not react outwardly, but he closed the Ranger camera and slid it back into its case with slow deliberation. What is coming, Manuelito? I asked, keeping my voice level. There was a long silence on the line. In that silence I could hear the recirculating hum of the hotel room where he must have been standing, 1,600 kilometers to the west, at his conference table, with a laptop open and my summary glowing on the screen. I am sending you ganado mucho, Manuelito said. I am sending you Delgadito. I am sending you Armijo. I am sending you Herrero Chiquito. Then we will see what else the situation requires. Now walk up those steps. Do not run. Do not turn around while you climb. Do not shine your lamps into the forest to either side. Just look at the wood in front of you and go. Barboncito and I looked at each other in the beam of my headlamp. We had never received an instruction like that from Manuelito. Never in 11 years. We began to climb. Somewhere behind us, 3 landings down, something moved. It was not the sound of an animal walking. It was the sound of a person walking, but the stride was too long. 2 of our steps up made 1 step down. We did not turn. We did not shine our lamps. We climbed. I did not sleep that night. Barboncito and I sat at the station house at the top of the Kmore lot, drinking coffee that had gone bitter in the pot, watching the tree line. The specialized team was inbound from Colorado. Their aircraft would touch down at the small regional airstrip 40 minutes east of the park before dawn. Barboncito had spoken twice with Manuelito on the encrypted line. He would not tell me what had been said. He said only that the men on the aircraft were the best in the country at what they did, and that we would understand when they arrived. They arrived at 4:50 in the morning. Ganado Mucho stepped out of the vehicle first. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders and long in the arm, but he moved with a quietness that seemed impossible for a body of his size. His hair was gray at the temples. He was 56 years old, and he had been tracking for the Interagency Wilderness Response Service for 30 of those years. Before that, he had run search operations along the southern border for the same service. He shook my hand and did not smile. His grip was calloused and dry. Behind him came Delgadito. Delgadito was much younger, perhaps 26, lean, with a wide-open face and a way of holding himself that suggested he had trained with soldiers. He carried 3 long duffel bags at once and set them down without effort. He greeted me with a nod. His eyes were already moving across the parking lot, cataloging every detail. Behind Delgadito came Armijo, who was middle-aged and squat, built like a stone. Armijo said hello and immediately asked if we had a paper map of the gorge with the recent trail closures marked in red. We had one. He took it, spread it across the hood of a vehicle, and began to study it under the parking lot light without speaking further to any of us. The last man to step out of the vehicle was Herrero Chiquito. He was small and quick, with eyes that seemed to hold too much attention at once, as though he could look at 3 things simultaneously. He was 30 years old. His nickname, I would learn later, had been given to him as a boy because he had built a knife from a broken car spring at the age of 9 and used it to kill a rattlesnake that had entered his family kitchen. He carried a coiled climbing rope over one shoulder. The 4 men gathered at the hood of the vehicle where Armijo had laid out the map. They spoke to one another in low voices. They asked me and Barboncito questions. They did not repeat questions. They did not take notes. Whatever we said, they retained. At 6 in the morning, with the first bar of gray light appearing above the ridge, we descended the miner's staircase together. I watched them work. It was like watching a piece of complicated equipment operate. Ganado Mucho led. He walked slowly, sometimes stopping for 2 minutes at a time to examine a scrape on a step or a stain on a handrail. Delgadito walked at his shoulder, silent, mirroring his attention. Armijo covered the flanks, moving off the path to the left or the right, examining the ground where nothing appeared to be. Herrero Chiquito ranged ahead, then came back, then ranged ahead again, like a hunting dog that never tired. At the 4th landing, Ganado Mucho stopped at the broken marker post. He touched the fresh break. He looked up at the sky through the gap in the canopy. He looked down at the platform. He said only one word. Confirmed. At the seventh landing, at the disturbed leaf litter beneath the broken hemlock branch, all four men stopped. They spread out around the depression. They knelt at the perimeter without stepping into it. Herrero Chiquito laid a small tarp beside the wider end. He set a series of small metal scales upon the tarp and began to weigh what appeared to be small samples of soil and hair. Armijo made a series of measurements. Delgadito took photographs. Ganado Mucho stood at the edge of the depression and simply looked at it for a long time. I stood a step behind Barbanchito. I watched. I did not interrupt. Ganado Mucho spoke without turning. The animal is on its feet, he said. It is not on all fours. The width of the shoulder impression relative to the length of the body impression and the placement of the hand marks at the wide end together indicate a bipedal specialist. Weight, approximately 370 kilograms. Height, standing, in excess of 250 centimeters. The break on the hemlock branch 4 meters off the trail is at a height of 310 centimeters, which is consistent. He paused. It was here for 19 hours. Barboncito made a small sound. How can you know that? I asked. The temperature of the ground beneath the shoulder impression, Ganado Mucho said. The rate of recolonization by the smaller insects across the perimeter. The compression pattern of the leaf litter as it recovers. 19 hours, plus or minus 2. Delgadito spoke for the first time. The visitor Cayetano signed in at 0917 yesterday morning, he said. He was expected to return by 1600. The animal took this position at approximately 1100 and left at approximately 0600 this morning. The visitor was inside the animal's territory for the entire descent. I opened my mouth. I closed it again. Where is the visitor? I asked. The four men looked at each other. They did not answer me. Ganado Mucho unhooked his radio. Manuelito, he said into it. Call Narbona. Call Jomesio. Call Zarcillos Largos. Bring them all. Narbona arrived at the ranger station at 4:30 in the afternoon of the same day. He was 73 years old. He walked with a wooden cane cut from a mesquite branch that had been polished by many decades of use. His hair was long and entirely white, and he wore a felt hat with a wide brim, and around his shoulders he had draped a heavy woolen blanket in a deep red pattern that his wife had woven for him many years before her passing. He did not speak when he entered the station. He shook hands. He accepted a cup of water. He sat in a wooden chair in the corner of the main office, and he watched. He watched Ganado Mucho spread the aerial photographs across the desk. He watched Armijo overlay a topographic sheet with red pencil marks. He watched Delgadito cross-reference the incident reports of the last 11 years for any similar signs. He watched Herrero Chiquito lay out gear on the linoleum floor and check the calibration of every instrument in silence. He watched me. Jomesio arrived at 5:12 in the afternoon. He was a heavy-set man of about 50, with a thick neck and a jaw that had been broken in 2 separate incidents earlier in his career. He wore standard tactical gear, but he had personalized it in small ways. His pack had been restitched by hand. His boots had been reheeled by a leather craftsman in Gallup. He had spent 23 years in interagency rescue. He did not ask what the situation was. He looked at Ganado Mucho, and Ganado Mucho said one word to him, and Jomesio nodded once and went to help Herrero Chiquito with the gear. Zarcillos Largos arrived last, at 6:23, driving alone in a beat-up truck with mud on the wheel wells. He was somewhere between 40 and 60. It was very hard to tell. He had the kind of face that had been in weather for so long that the age no longer showed clearly. He was tall and slim and moved as though he had once been much heavier. He carried a rifle case in one hand and a small pack in the other. He greeted Narbona first, before anyone else. He greeted him with a bow of the head so slight that I would have missed it if I had blinked. Then Zarcillos Largos went to the corner and set down his rifle case beside Narbona's chair and asked, in a low voice, "How bad?" Narbona looked at him and said only, "It is one of the old ones." I felt the room go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the ceasing of speech. Barboncito walked over to Narbona's chair and sat on the floor at his feet. It was a gesture I had not seen since my grandmother's funeral 14 years ago. It was the gesture of a younger person preparing to hear something from an older person that would change how the younger person understood their life. Narbona spoke to us all, without raising his voice. He told us that there are beings in the folded places of this continent that have been walking these mountains and forests since long before the first log cabin, long before the first steel spike was driven into a rail, long before the first survey chain was dragged across the land by men in linen coats. He said that some of these beings were once known by many names in many languages. He said that the older peoples of these eastern woods, whose descendants still walk this valley today, had their own words for the being now walking in the New River Gorge, and that those words were not spoken lightly. He said that his own people, though they lived in the desert far to the west, had received the same knowledge from cousins who had traded and traveled these mountains many generations ago. He said the being does not eat as we understand eating. He said it takes. He said what it takes is not always the body. He said that the being will announce itself by 3 signs before it takes. It will break something that a man made, at a height only it can reach. It will leave hair but only where it chooses to leave hair. It will make a sound that the canyon will refuse to echo. I felt the coffee in my stomach turn to cold water. I had recorded, in my own incident report the previous night, precisely those 3 things. Narbona looked at me. I felt as though he had read the report through my forehead. "The visitor," he said, "is not yet lost. Not entirely. The being takes slowly." "How slowly?" Ganado Mucho asked. Narbona thought for a moment. 3 nights, he said. "From the first sign, 3 nights. We have entered the second." Ganado Mucho stood up from the desk. He picked up his hat. "We move in an hour," he said. "Full weight, full lights, full sound discipline, until we reach the base of the canyon. Zarcillos Largos and Jomesio on the outer perimeter. Delgadito and Armijo on the traverse. Herrero Chiquito on the drone camera. Barbuncito with the ranger. Narbona at the base station with Manuelito on the encrypted line." He looked at me. "Ranger," he said, "you know this ground. You will walk in the middle of the line. You will do exactly what Barbuncito tells you to do. You will not respond to any voice that speaks to you from beyond the light. You will not speak to any figure that appears at the edge of the light unless Barbuncito confirms it first. Do you understand?" "I understand." Narbona lifted his hand from the arm of the chair. "One more thing," he said. We all turned. "When you hear the sound," Narbona said, "and you will hear it again tonight. When you hear it, do not answer it. Do not call out. Do not sing. Do not whistle. Do not respond with words in any language you know, even in your thoughts. The being can hear a thought aimed at it in the same way that a person can hear a shout aimed at their name. Keep your thoughts on the ground, on the trail, on the person walking in front of you. If you must think of something else, think of the face of a child you love. Then it will pass through you without catching." Herrero Chiquito was the first to leave the office. He walked out into the coming night with his climbing rope over his shoulder and his small pack on his back and a set of night vision goggles hanging around his neck. Barbuncito followed. I followed Barbuncito. Behind me came Delgadito, Armijo, Zarcillos Largos, Jomesio, and Ganado Mucho. Narbona sat in his chair and watched us go, one by one, out into the wide swallowing evening of the gorge. We walked into the trees. We began the descent for the second time in 24 hours. None of us knew that 4 of us would not walk out again in the same shape we had walked in. We reached the base of the miner's staircase at 7:40 in the evening. The last of the day had gone by then, and the canyon walls above us were a deep pooling gray, not yet black. The New River ran below us at a low autumn level. The sound of the water was a soft, continuous murmur that under other conditions I have found soothing. That night I did not find it soothing. Ganado Mucho set the formation. Herrero Chiquito went ahead with the drone camera, launching it silently at low altitude to sweep the canyon floor ahead of us. Delgadito and Armijo took the traverse, meaning they walked along the higher ground above the trail, one on each flank, keeping the line visible without exposing themselves. Zarcillos Largos and Jomesio walked the outer perimeter. Barboncito walked directly in front of me. Ganado Mucho walked directly behind me. I was, as ordered, in the middle of the line. We moved along the old railway grade toward the abandoned coke ovens at Caymore. The ovens were the last confirmed destination of Cayetano. Their brick beehive shapes stood against the base of the cliff, roofless now, filled with fallen leaves and the roots of small trees that had grown up through the mortar over the century since the mine closed. At the first oven, Herrero Chiquito's drone camera picked up something. I saw it on the small screen Ganado Mucho held against his chest. A figure, or the shape of a figure, standing inside the second oven from the left. The shape did not move. The camera passed over it once. On the second pass, the shape was gone. Ganado Mucho did not react outwardly. He handed the screen back to Herrero Chiquito. He signed with 2 fingers. Zarcillos Largos moved without sound toward the second oven, rifle at the ready. Jomesio moved to the third. Delgadito and Armijo held the traverse. Zarcillos Largos entered the oven. He was inside for 6 seconds. He came out and shook his head once. There was no figure inside. But when Barboncito examined the interior of the oven with his own beam, he found, on the sooted brick wall, a hand mark. The mark was pressed low, near the floor. It was the width of a large dinner plate. It was made in something that looked like tar and smelled like nothing that grew in these mountains. A strong scent, musk, wet fur, iron, and a fourth smell I did not know how to name and that I hope never to encounter again. Barboncito bagged the sample. He said, "It is fresh, less than 30 minutes." Ganado Mucho spoke into his radio, very quietly, and I heard the reply from Narbona at the base station. And I heard from Narbona's voice that we were now in the last of the 3 nights, and that we had been permitted to find this sample as a warning. We proceeded. We followed the trail west along the base of the cliff toward the second cluster of oven ruins. The temperature dropped sharply. My breath began to steam in my headlamp beam. Barboncito, ahead of me, did not turn but held up his left hand in the signal to slow. We slowed. Then Herrero Chiquito, at the front, made the sound in his throat that meant stop. We stopped. Ahead, in the middle of the trail, on top of a flat gray stone, someone had placed a paperback book. A paperback book with a bird on the cover. Cayetano's book. The book was open, spine up, pages splayed against the stone, in the way a reader might set a book down while they went to look at something interesting off the trail. It was completely dry, though the surface of the stone around it was wet with the evening's condensation. The book had not been rained on, and no dew had settled upon it, though everything else within a 10-meter radius was covered with a fine wet gloss. The book had been placed there. Between us and the book, in the wet dust of the trail, a line of impressions stretched. They were barefoot impressions, enormous, toes as long as my hand, arch as deep as a soup bowl. They marched from the base of the cliff, out across the trail, up to the flat gray stone, and then back into the trees on the riverside. There was no return trail. Whatever had placed the book had not walked away. It was still standing in the trees on the riverside. Watching, Ganado Mucho signaled without words. Zarcillos Largos went to one knee. Jomesio went to one knee. Delgadito and Armijo went flat on the traverse. Herrero Chiquito lay against the base of the cliff with the drone controller. Barboncito stayed standing directly in front of me. I felt the hilt of his personal knife touch the back of my hand as he offered it to me. I took it. My hand was steady. I do not know why. I have thought about it many times since, perhaps because Barboncito was standing there. Perhaps because I could feel Narbona's voice at the base station in the small transmitter behind my ear. Perhaps because I remembered the face of the child Narbona had told me to think of. I thought of my sister's daughter, who was 4 years old that year. I held her face in my mind like a candle held against a wind. The sound came. The third night's call. It came from the trees on the riverside, 20 meters from where I stood, at a height that I estimated as 5 meters off the ground. It was long and low, and it made the air in my chest go completely still. My lungs would not accept the movement of my ribs. My heartbeat became something I could see behind my eyes. I did not respond. I did not call out. I did not sing. I did not whistle. I did not think in words in any language I knew. I thought of the face of my sister's daughter. The sound stopped. The gorge did not echo it. Then the trees on the riverside split apart, and something 8 feet tall stepped through them. It did not walk. It flowed. Its arms were long as ape arms, and its head was set forward on its shoulders in the way of no man and no bear. It was covered in coarse hair the color of wet earth. Its eyes caught the light of Barboncito's beam and returned it back to us as a flat yellow reflection, wide apart, higher off the ground than the eyes of any animal in these mountains have ever been recorded. Zarcillos largos fired. Once. The being did not fall. It turned. It looked up along the traverse. Delgadito rolled off the higher ground toward the trail, exposing his position. Armijo did the same on the other side. The being took one step toward Delgadito. One step covered 3 meters. Jomicio fired. The being turned again. Jomicio was standing behind a boulder at the base of the cliff. The being moved toward the boulder. In the moment before the being reached him, Jomicio said something. I could not hear what he said. He said it quietly. His voice was calm. Then the being reached the boulder. Jomicio was not there any longer. I did not see him picked up. I did not see him struck. I saw him standing behind the boulder. Then I did not see him at all. Hero Chiquito activated the drone camera to full spotlight. The canyon floor lit up in a hard white circle. The being flinched. It turned its head away from the light. In that moment, Ganado Mucho fired 3 shots into the wide chest of the creature. The being roared. The roar had no echo. The being fell to one knee. It rose again. It looked directly at me. Its yellow eyes held me. I felt them go through me the way a hand goes through a curtain. I thought again of my sister's daughter. I held her face in my mind. The being roared a second time. The canyon refused the sound. Then the being turned and ran. It ran toward the flat gray stone where Cayetano's book still lay. It stopped at the stone. It picked up the book. It carried the book to the trees on the riverside. It was gone in the time it takes a man to draw one breath. Barboncito was the first to move. He went to the boulder where Jomicio had been standing. He was there for a long moment. When he returned to the trail, his face was set in the way a face is set when the person behind it does not want to speak of what he has just seen. We had lost Jomicio. We had lost the book. We had not lost the trail. Ganado Mucho signaled. The line reformed. Zarcillos Largos and Delgadito and Armijo came down from the higher ground. Herrero Chiquito recovered the drone. We turned back toward the miner's staircase. We climbed for the second time in 24 hours. We did not speak. We did not turn. We did not shine our lamps into the trees on either side. We climbed. Somewhere behind us, at the bottom, something walked with a stride we could no longer measure. And somewhere, in the folded caves at the base of the cliff, a man named Cayetano was still alive, and Narbona had told us we had until sunrise to bring him back. At the top of the staircase, the 7 of us gathered on the platform. Barboncito counted heads without seeming to count. Ganado Mucho spoke into his radio. Narbona answered him from the base station. Manuelito's voice came on the encrypted line from Denver. Ganado Mucho gave the report in one sentence. We have lost Jomicio at the second oven cluster. We have located the personal effect of the missing visitor. The visitor is confirmed alive, in the folded caves below the West Traverse, until sunrise. We are returning to base to reprovision. We will descend a second time in 90 minutes. Manuelito answered. You are not going alone. I am on a plane. I will be with you in 6 hours. Ganado Mucho did not respond. He knew as well as I did that 6 hours was too late. At the ranger station, Narbona had prepared what needed to be prepared. He had a small cast-iron pot on the wood stove with something simmering inside it. He would not say what was in the pot. He had laid out, on the desk where the aerial photographs had been, 7 small woven pouches. Each pouch was tied at the neck with a strand of red wool. Each pouch had a specific pattern of beads. He handed a pouch to each of us. He did not hand one to himself. Wear this against the skin, he said. It does not have to be over the heart. It only has to be beneath the shirt, in contact with skin. Do not open it. Do not show it to another person. If you die, whoever finds your body will know what to do with it. We wore the pouches. Ganado mucho, Zarcio largos, delgadito, armijo, heredo chiquito, barboncito, and I. 7 pouches, 7 of us. The 8th man, Homesio, was already at the base of the canyon, in whatever form he had become. We reprovisioned in silence. Water, batteries, ropes. The gear that Herrero Chiquito had specifically requested, and that had come with him on the aircraft, sealed in a black case that he had not yet opened. He opened it now. Inside were 6 devices that looked like short cylindrical flashlights. He explained, in a very quiet voice, that they emitted a specific frequency of sound in a narrow beam. The frequency was one that the older stories described as unbearable to the being. He handed one device to each of us. He kept the 6th for himself. "Do not activate the device," he said, "until you see the being's face. If you activate it too early, the being will simply move away, and we will lose the position of the caves. If you activate it too late, it will not save you. Wait until you see the face." We each took the device. I put mine into my breast pocket. Narbona took me aside as we prepared to leave. He said, "You will go into the cave first." I did not react. I had known, somehow, that this was going to be asked of me. It was my park. It was my staircase. It was my visitor. "Barboncito will be at your shoulder," Narbona said. "Zarcilos Largos will be at the mouth of the cave with the rifle. The other 4 will hold the perimeter. When you find the visitor, you will not look at his eyes. Do you understand this? You will look at his hands. You will speak his name. You will place your own hand on his shoulder. You will lead him out. If he does not follow, you will pull him. You will not turn back for anything. You will not turn back if you hear a voice you love. You will not turn back if you hear the voice of a child. You will not turn back if the walls of the cave speak your name in your grandmother's voice. Do you understand this?" "I understand." He placed his old hand against the side of my face. "Come back," he said. We drove to the trailhead. We descended the miner's staircase for the 3rd time. It was 2 in the morning. The gorge was quieter than I had ever known it to be. Even the murmur of the river below seemed hushed, as though the water itself had been asked to hold its voice. We reached the base of the West Traverse. Herrero Chiquito's drone camera identified the folded caves. They opened at the base of a rock face that had, in the daylight, always appeared to be simply solid stone. In the beam of the drone's spotlight, the mouth of the largest cave was a black wound in the cliff face, 10 meters wide and 4 meters high, curtained by hanging roots. I approached first, as instructed. Barboncito was at my shoulder. Zarcilos Largos stood at the mouth of the cave with the rifle steady across his forearm. Delgadito and Armijo covered the outer perimeter with the sound devices ready. Ganado Mucho and Herrero Chiquito remained at the entry of the traverse to coordinate. I stepped through the curtain of roots into the cave. The cave was warm. That was the first thing I noticed. The temperature inside the cave was many degrees warmer than the canyon floor outside. The air smelled of damp rock and of the same musk that had filled the coke oven, though muted. There was a low sound, a breathing sound, slow and deep, very deep, the sound of a large chest rising and falling. The being was somewhere in the cave. I did not look for it. I looked for Cayetano. He was sitting against the back wall of the cave, cross-legged, hands loose in his lap. His eyes were open. He was looking at the ceiling of the cave. He did not turn his head when I entered. He did not react when Barboncito shone his headlamp on him. He was breathing normally. There was no visible injury on his body. His clothes were dusty but not torn. I remembered Narbona's instruction, "Do not look at the eyes." I looked at his hands. His hands were folded, palms up, in his lap. On the palm of his left hand, someone had drawn, in dust, a small mark shaped like an arrow. It was the same mark he had drawn beside his name in the trailhead register. I said his name. "Cayetano." He did not respond. I stepped closer. Barboncito stayed at my shoulder. The breathing at the back of the cave was very loud now. I could feel it in the bones of my chest. I said his name again. "Cayetano." He blinked. Just once. slowly. It was the first sign of awareness. Behind him, in the deep part of the cave, something shifted. I put my hand on his shoulder. His shoulder was warm through the flannel of his shirt. He turned his head very slowly toward me. His face was empty, but his eyes were looking at me, and I did not look at them. I looked at his hands. I said, "Get up, we are going home." He rose. He rose the way a person rises out of a deep chair, slowly, without hurry. He took my hand. His hand was warm. I turned toward the mouth of the cave. Barboncito was already there, at the curtain of roots, the sound device raised in his fist. Cayetano walked behind me, holding my hand. Behind us, the breathing at the back of the cave stopped. Then a voice spoke. The voice was my grandmother's voice. It said my name. I did not turn. The voice repeated my name. It was so exactly the voice of my grandmother that I could smell the sage in her kitchen and the wood of her table and the ink of the letters she used to write to me when I was at the Ranger Academy. My grandmother had been gone for 8 years. I did not turn. I walked to the curtain of roots. Barboncito parted them for me. Cayetano walked behind me. At the mouth of the cave, Zarcilos Largos held the rifle across his forearm. Beyond him, in the beam of the drone's spotlight, Delgadito and Armijo held the perimeter. Ganado Mucho waited at the traverse. Behind us, deep in the cave, the being roared. The canyon refused the sound. We ran. We ran up the traverse, and up the miner's staircase, and up the many landings, and up the wooden platforms, and up to the ridge, and up to the trailhead at Caymore. Manuelito was there. He had landed at the airstrip an hour early. He had driven straight to the trailhead. He was standing in the parking lot when we came up out of the gorge, with the dawn just beginning to gray the eastern sky. He was standing beside Narbona. Narbona was holding the mesquite cane. Manuelito was holding a heavy woolen blanket in the same deep red pattern as Narbona's. Manuelito wrapped the blanket around Cayetano's shoulders. Narbona placed his hand on Cayetano's forehead. Cayetano's eyes closed. His knees loosened. Barboncito and Zarcilos Largos caught him under the arms and laid him gently on the paved edge of the parking lot. He was breathing steadily. He was alive. The dawn came. The sound from the gorge did not return. Not that morning. Not the next. The report I filed with the Interagency Service listed Cayetano as recovered, with a minor case of exposure and shock. He remembered nothing of his descent. He remembered nothing of the being. He returned to his family a week later. He never came back to the New River Gorge, and I have never invited him. Joe Messio was recorded as lost during an interagency rescue operation. His family received the flag and the honors and a private letter from Manuelito that no one else was permitted to read. I have visited his grave every October 11th since that year. I bring a small woven pouch with a strand of red wool tied at the neck. I lay it on the stone. I do not open the pouch. I do not read the beads. The being is still in the gorge. Ganado Mucho and Herrero Chiquito confirmed the position of the folded caves and reported the same to the higher offices. The offices did not act. They never do. But every ranger who serves long enough in these mountains eventually meets Manuelito, or Narbona, or one of the specialists from the Interagency Service, and they are told what they need to know, and they are given what they need to carry. We do not speak of it publicly. We speak of it only in these accounts, and we ask you, who have listened this far, to think of us the next time you visit a national park and stand at a rim and look down into a canyon that seems too still. If you hear a call that the walls refuse to answer, do not answer it either. Turn away. Walk to your vehicle. Drive to the ranger station. Tell the person at the desk what you heard. They will know. They will have received the training. They will have carried the pouch. If this account has moved you, if you have felt the cold of that canyon in your own skin as I have felt it in mine, please leave a comment below with the name of the park you first fell in love with, so that we may know where else in this wide country the older stories are still alive. Press the small heart button, subscribe, so that the next account reaches you when it comes. The being is still in the gorge. I still wear the pouch. The gorge is very old. I am not yet old, but I have heard the sound 3 times, and I have gone down the staircase 3 times, and I have come back up 3 times, and every October, when the light begins to leave the canyon in the way that light leaves a canyon in autumn, I check my breast pocket for the sound device, and I check my collar for the pouch, and I check the trailhead register for a name I do not recognize, and I ready my radio, and I wait. Because the being is still there. And there will always be another Cayetano. 6 sleeping bags, not counting my own. I counted them every morning of that trip before I unzipped the tent flap, and I counted them again every night before I let myself close my eyes, and the number was correct every single time, until the night it was not. People ask me why a grown man would lie in a bag in the cold and count the breathing shapes of his friends like a nervous parent. The answer is that I did not start doing it out of fear. I started doing it out of habit, because I was the one who organized the trip, and organizing means counting. By the 4th night, it was not a habit anymore. It was the only thing keeping me sane. We went into Glacier Bay on the 12th of July. There were 7 of us, which is 2 more than I would normally take into that kind of country, and every one of them had signed the liability sheet at the visitor station in Bartlett Cove with a pen that kept freezing up in the damp. The ranger who briefed us was maybe 25 years old and had the flat, patient voice of somebody who gives the same speech 11 times a day. Store your food in the containers we provide. Do not cook where you sleep. Keep 100 yards between yourself and any bear you see, and if the bear closes that distance, you have already made your mistake. Do not travel alone. Do not leave the tide line unless you know exactly where the tide is going to be in 6 hours. She said one other thing at the end, and she said it quickly, the way people say things they are not supposed to include. If you hear somebody calling for help out on the water at night, she said, radio it in. Do not go out to it yourself. Kenneth Jenkins laughed. Kenneth was 61, a retired freight dispatcher out of Bellingham, built like a fire hydrant, and he had the kind of laugh that made strangers turn around in restaurants. He asked her if that was park policy or ghost story policy. She did not smile. She said it was policy, and she stamped our permit, and she went back to her paperwork, and I remember thinking that she had not answered the question at all. Let me tell you who was on that boat, because their names matter to me more than anything else I am about to describe. Edward Barnes was 70 years old and had no business being there, and he knew it, and he had come anyway. He was thin in the way that old men who have worked outdoors their whole lives are thin, all cable and knuckle, and he had spent 40 years running range fence in New Mexico before his wife died, and his daughter moved him up to Juneau to be closer to family. He talked less than anyone else in the group. When he did talk, people stopped what they were doing to listen, and I never understood why until later. Danielle Ross was 47, a wildlife photographer, the only one of us who had been into the West Arm before. She carried a camera body worth more than my truck, and she carried it strapped across her chest like a soldier carries a weapon. She had a habit of narrating what she saw out loud, quietly, to nobody, as though she were dictating captions. Sean Henderson was 44, and the strongest paddler among us by a wide margin. Sean had done Prince William Sound twice, and he had an easy, careless confidence about cold water that I envied and also did not entirely trust. Diane Coleman was 56, a retired schoolteacher from Spokane, and she was the reason the group functioned. She was the one who noticed when somebody was quiet, who packed the extra stove fuel, who remembered which of us was allergic to what. Kenneth I have already described. He was loud and warm, and he snored so badly that we had put him in a tent by himself, which I have thought about every day since. Monica Perry was 38, the youngest, a hydrology technician who had taken the summer off. She was the one who had wanted to see the Tidewater ice calve into the sea, and she was the one who kept saying, all through the first 2 days, that the bay was quieter than she had expected. She was right. That is what nobody tells you about Glacier Bay in July. The brochures show you ice the color of a gas flame collapsing into the water in a wall of thunder. What they do not show you is the 11 hours between one collapse and the next, when the whole inlet lies flat and gray and absolutely silent, and the mountains come down into the water on both sides so steep that there is no beach, no margin, no place to stand. Sound does strange things in a place like that. A voice from a mile away arrives at your ear like a whisper from 2 feet behind you. A raven croaking on a ridge sounds like a man clearing his throat in your tent. The boat dropped us at the mouth of a small unnamed cove in the lower west arm on the afternoon of the 12th. The captain did not shut his engine off. He held the bow against the gravel long enough for us to hand the kayaks and the dry bags over the rail, and then he backed off, and he lifted one hand, and the sound of his motor went down the inlet and thinned out and disappeared, and we were alone in a way that most people alive today have never been alone. No road, no trail, no cell coverage of any kind. 65 miles of cold water between us and the nearest building. One satellite communicator in Diane's dry bag, and one marine radio in mine, and a scheduled pickup at that same cove 8 days later. We made camp above the high tide line on a shelf of gravel and beach rye. 3 tents in a rough triangle. The cook site 150 feet downwind. Sean built a driftwood fire out of silver logs that had been in the salt so long they burned green at the edges. Kenneth produced a bottle of rye whiskey that he had smuggled in against my explicit instructions, and everybody drank a little except Edward, who sat with his back to a rock and watched the tree line. The tree line is what I want to tell you about. Behind that gravel shelf, the land went up almost immediately into spruce and hemlock. Not a forest, the way people in the lower states picture forest. Something older and wetter than that. The trees grew out of a floor of moss 4 feet deep, so that when you walked into it, you did not walk on the ground. You walked on a mattress laid over the ground, and every step sank and rebounded, and the sound of your own footfall came back to you delayed and muffled. There were places in there where the moss had grown over a fallen log and formed a hollow underneath, and you could put your boot through it up to the knee. Nobody went in past 30 yards. There was no reason to. Around 10 in the evening, with the light still up because the light stays up until almost midnight there in July, Danielle raised her camera at something on the far edge of the shelf where the gravel met the moss. She said, quietly, in that captioning voice of hers, "Wolf, male, 140 yards, poor light." I turned. I saw it. It was standing in the gap between 2 spruce trunks with its head low, and it was watching the fire, and it was a wolf. I want to be very clear about that. It was a wolf, gray and brown through the shoulder, thick in the rough, entirely ordinary. The 4th wolf I had seen in 22 years of taking people into that state. Danielle took 11 photographs of it. Then it stood up. I do not mean that it rose from a crouch. I mean that its front legs came off the ground, and its spine straightened, and it went up and up until it was standing on its hind legs with its forelimbs hanging at its sides, and it was tall. Taller than Sean, taller than any of us, and it held that position without swaying for what I later worked out was somewhere between 8 and 11 seconds. Nobody at that fire made a sound. Then it dropped back down onto 4 legs and turned, and went into the trees without any hurry at all, and the moss took the sound of it, and it was gone. Kenneth broke first. He laughed, but it came out wrong, high and short, and he said that a bear had come up behind it, that we had all just watched a wolf get spooked by a bear it could smell and we could not. Sean agreed immediately and loudly. Diane said nothing. Monica had both hands wrapped around her cup and was looking at the trees. Danielle went to her camera and scrolled back through the 11 frames. She looked at them for a long time. Then she said that the camera had not caught it. She said the last 4 frames were the empty gap between the trunks, and the 7 before that were the animal on all 4s. And there was nothing in between, no blur, no partial, nothing. She said the timestamps were continuous. Edward Barnes had not moved from his rock the entire time. When Danielle said that, he stood up, and he walked over to the fire, and he put 3 pieces of wood on it that we did not need, building it up higher than it had been all evening. Then he said the first strange thing I heard him say. He said, "We are going to want to be able to see the edges tonight." I asked him the edges of what? He said, of everything. I did not sleep well. Around 2 in the morning, in that gray half-light that passes for night up there, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside my tent. Slow ones, deliberate, somebody walking the perimeter of our camp, tent to tent to tent, all the way around, and then around again. I assumed it was Kenneth going out to relieve himself. I lay there and listened to it complete 4 full circuits of the camp, and then stop, and then I heard nothing more, and eventually I slept. In the morning I asked Kenneth about it over coffee, and I made a joke about his bladder, and he looked at me with his cup halfway to his mouth and told me he had not left his tent once all night. Then he said, "But I heard it too." He said he had lain awake listening to it, and he had assumed it was me. We got out the map after breakfast, and I made the group agree to a rule. Nobody walks alone. Nobody goes into the trees. If you need to leave camp, you take one other person and you tell a third where you are going. Everybody agreed. Everybody meant it. That rule held for exactly 36 hours. The second day was beautiful, and I need to say that, because it makes the rest of it worse. We paddled north up the arm with the tide, 6 kayaks in a loose line, Sean out front, Edward and Diane in the double in the middle where I could see them. The water was so flat it took the mountains and doubled them, and the only sound for hours was the drip off the paddle blades. We saw a humpback sound about 400 yards off the eastern shore, and Monica actually cried a little, and nobody made fun of her for it. Around 3 in the afternoon we came around a point and the ice was there. A wall of it, 200 feet high at the face, blue in the fractures, grinding down out of a valley between 2 peaks and stopping where the sea stopped it. We rafted the boats up and sat there for an hour, and watched a section the size of an apartment building lean out and go into the water. And the wave came at us and lifted us and set us down, and the noise arrived 4 seconds after the sight of it. Danielle got her photographs. Monica got her ice. Kenneth told a story about his ex-wife that made Diane laugh until she had to hold on to Sean's boat. We turned back with the tide, and were in camp by 7, with the light still high. And that was the last good hour any of us had. The first thing that was wrong was the food containers. We had 4 of them, hard plastic canisters, set in a row in a shallow scrape 60 yards downwind of the tents. Bear canisters are designed to defeat an animal with 900 pounds of jaw pressure and no thumbs. They latch with a mechanism that requires a coin or a screwdriver blade to turn. And it is a mechanism that gives people with arthritis real trouble. All 4 canisters were open. Not broken, not chewed, not scratched, not dented. Opened, correctly, by the latch, and set upright in a row with their lids beside them. Nothing was taken, not one thing. Sean counted the food out against the inventory list twice because he did not believe it, and every packet and bar and bag was accounted for. Diane said, very quietly, that somebody was messing with us, that there was another party camped nearby, and this was somebody's idea of a joke. Sean took the marine radio and made a general call and got nothing back, which meant nothing by itself. The terrain in there eats radio like it eats sound. Edward crouched down by the canisters for a long time with his hands on his knees, and then he asked Sean to close them all again, and to close them properly, and to spin the latches all the way over. Sean did it. Edward watched him do it. Then Edward said, "We will know in the morning." That night, at some hour after midnight, the voice started. It came from the water, from out in the inlet, maybe 150 yards off the gravel, and it was calling for help. It was Monica's voice. I want to describe this correctly because it is the part people always get wrong when they retell it. It was not an imitation. It was not close. It was not a good impression of Monica Perry. It was her voice, her exact voice, the specific rasp she got in the back of her throat when she had been talking all day, the way she pulled the vowel long in the word please. If somebody had played me a recording of it, I would have identified it as her without a second of hesitation. And she was screaming for us. She was screaming that she was in the water, that she was caught on something, that it was cold, that she could not feel her legs, that somebody needed to come now. I came out of my tent with a knife in my hand and no boots on, and I was already 30 feet toward the water when Diane hit me in the chest with both hands and knocked me sideways onto the gravel. Monica was standing right behind her, standing in the door of her tent in a thermal layer and wool socks, both hands over her own mouth, staring out at the water, listening to herself drown. The voice went on for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because Danielle, who was the steadiest of all of us, and I will never stop admiring her for it, looked at her watch when it started, and looked at it again when it stopped. For 11 minutes, the six of us stood in a knot in the middle of that gravel shelf and listened to Monica Perry beg us to save her. And Monica Perry stood in the middle of us with her hands over her mouth, and none of us moved. It changed twice. Around minute 6, it stopped being a scream and became a kind of exhausted, hitching sob, the sound of somebody who has been in cold water long enough to stop fighting it. Around minute 9, it started using our names. It called for me. It called for Sean. It called for Kenneth twice. And the second time it drew his name out in a way that made him put his hand on Diane's shoulder to stay upright. Then it stopped mid-word, not fading, not moving away. It stopped in the middle of the second syllable of Kenneth's name, the way a recording stops when you lift the needle. Nobody spoke for a while after that. It was Kenneth, of all people, who finally said what everybody was thinking. He said, "That thing knows our names." Edward said, "No." He said, "It knows the shape of our names, which is not the same, and it does not matter. And here is what matters." He said, "From now on, nobody goes toward a voice." He said, "If you hear one of us calling from outside the light, you do not answer it, you do not go to it, you do not even turn your head toward it. You come to the fire and you count faces. If all the faces are here, then there is nothing out there that needs you." Sean asked him how he knew that. Edward said, "Because I have heard one before." Nobody slept. We built the fire up and the six of us sat around it in a ring until the light came, and the light comes early there, and by 4 in the morning you can read a map without a headlamp. At first full light I walked down to the canisters with Sean. All 4 were open again, lids off, set beside them in a row, nothing missing. And in the wet sand at the edge of the tide line, 20 feet away, there was a line of tracks. They came out of the water and went up the beach toward the canisters, and then turned and went along the tree line and into the moss. There were about 40 of them, clean and deep in the wet sand, and they were the tracks of an animal walking on 4 legs, wolf-sized or bigger, the pads and claws perfectly clear. For the first 14 prints. Then, without any break in the stride, without a stumble or a scuff, or a place where the animal stopped and reared up, the tracks became the prints of a bare human foot, left, right, the same length of stride, the same line, the same depth, walking on up the beach as though nothing at all had happened in between. Sean got down on his knees and put his own hand flat into one of them. The human prints were longer than his forearm. We should have left that morning. I have gone over this 10,000 times. The satellite communicator was in Diane's dry bag, and it worked, and we tested it, and the message went out, and we got the delivery confirmation. But a message is not a helicopter. The reply we got back, 4 hours later, was that our report had been logged, that no emergency criteria had been met, and that a vessel could divert to our coordinates in approximately 31 hours if we wanted an early extraction, weather permitting. 31 hours. We voted. This is the part that I am ashamed of. Sean and Kenneth voted to stay, because in daylight, with coffee, with the sun on the water, 4 open plastic canisters and a set of strange tracks in the sand did not seem like enough to abandon a trip that had cost every one of us $3,000 and a year of planning. Danielle voted to stay because she wanted the ice at dawn. Monica voted to leave. Diane voted to leave. I voted to leave. Edward abstained. He said the vote did not matter, because the boat could not get to us for 31 hours either way, and the only real question was how we spent them. So we requested the early pickup, and we settled in to wait, and Edward Barnes sat down on the gravel by the fire in the middle of the afternoon and told us what he had been carrying since 1974. He had been 22 years old, working a fence line on a lease east of Chinle, in the high desert country of northern Arizona. 2 of them on that job, him and a man named Harlan Yazzie, who was 10 years older and who Edward described as the most competent human being he had ever worked beside. They lived out of a truck for weeks at a time. One evening in October, Harlan started rushing. Edward said he had never seen the man rush at anything in 2 years. Harlan packed the tools while there was still an hour of daylight left, and he drove them 14 miles back to a paved road and would not say why. And that night, camped with the truck between them and the west, Harlan told Edward that something had walked into their work site behind him twice that day, and stood there while he pretended not to see it. Edward asked what it was. Harlan told him a word, and then he told him never to repeat that word out loud at night, and then he told him the rules. Edward gave us the rules the same way he had gotten them. Flat. In order, not as a story. It borrows. That was the first one. It borrows what it has been near. A coyote, a dog, a man. It takes the shape and it takes the sound and it wears them badly, and the badness is how you know. It cannot be first. It does not initiate. It answers. It calls when you have gone quiet. It appears when you have gone alone. It comes to the edge of what you have built, and it waits to be invited across, which is why you never answer, and never go alone, and never leave the light. It is curious before it is hungry. It will do pointless things first. It will move objects and put them back. It will open what you closed. It is learning the shape of you, and the pointless things are how it learns, and while it is doing pointless things you still have time. And the last one. When it stops doing pointless things, you have hours, not days. Danielle asked the question I could not make myself ask. She asked why a thing from the Arizona desert would be standing in a spruce forest in southeast Alaska. Edward said that he had asked Harlan Yazzie the same kind of question once, and that Harlan had told him he was thinking about it the wrong way around. He said, "You are thinking of it like an animal with a territory. It is not that. It is a thing that goes where it is welcome, and it is welcome wherever people are thin on the ground and far from help." Then Edward said something else, and this is the part one have never been able to put down. He said that when he moved to Juneau 3 years earlier, his daughter's neighbor was a Tlingit man in his 80s, who had spent his whole life on that water, and Edward, because he had been carrying it for 40 years and had nobody left to tell, told that old man about Chinle one evening, all of it, and used the word Harlan had given him. He said the old man did not laugh, and did not tell him he was wrong, and did not seem surprised. He said the old man listened to the whole thing, and then nodded and said, "We have that here too. We do not call it what you called it." And then he told Edward that the local version comes out of the water, that it takes the voices of the drowned and of your own family, and that it calls to people who are alone on the shore, and that the whole point of it, the entire mechanism of the thing, is to make you walk toward it of your own will. The old man had said one more thing, and Edward repeated it to us word for word. He said, "It is not two different animals. It is one animal, and it has been listening to us for a very long time, and it uses whatever it heard last." The fire popped. Nobody said anything for a while. Kenneth Jenkins finally stood up and dusted off his pants and said, "Well, that is the single most horrifying thing anybody has ever said to me, and I am going to go get more wood." He took Sean with him, and they went along the beach and not into the trees, and they were back inside 20 minutes with an armload of driftwood, and everything was fine. That was the last completely normal thing that happened. The pointless things stopped that evening. I did not recognize the significance of it at the time. I only noticed that the canisters stayed shut, and the perimeter footsteps did not come, and the voice did not call from the water. Around 11, with the light going soft and gray, Diane said out loud that maybe it had moved on, and I remember the relief in the way everybody straightened up when she said it. Edward stood and went and got the axe out of the gear pile and sat back down with it across his knees. Nobody asked him why. At 2:20 in the morning, Sean Henderson went to relieve himself. He was gone from the tent for less than 4 minutes. He did not go into the trees. He went 25 yards down the gravel to a boulder we had all been using, which was well within the firelight, and he was in sight of Kenneth's tent the entire time. When he came back and knelt to unzip his tent, Danielle was awake, and she looked out through her own mesh, and she saw him from 30 feet away in gray light with the fire still going. She said he did it wrong. She said Sean Henderson knelt down in front of his tent and reached for the zipper pull and missed it. Reached again and missed it again. She said he tried 5 times, and each time his fingers closed on the fabric an inch to the left of the pull, and each time he adjusted by exactly the same amount and missed by exactly the same amount, like a machine repeating an error. On the 6th attempt he found the pull, and he opened the tent, and he went inside. And Danielle, lying there, said out loud, into her own tent, quietly, without meaning to, 3 words. She said, "Sean, are you all right?" She answered a voice. That was the mistake. Not a shout in the night, not a scream on the water. 3 words spoken in kindness through nylon mesh at 2:30 in the morning. In the morning, Sean was in his sleeping bag, and he was fine. He was completely, entirely fine. And he made coffee, and he told a story about Prince William Sound, and he laughed at the right places, and he ate 2 packets of oatmeal, and Danielle sat there and looked at him and could not say why her hands would not stop shaking. He got the story slightly wrong, that was all. He said the Sound trip had been in June, and it had been in August. And when Kenneth corrected him, he agreed immediately and easily and moved on. That was the only thing. The extraction vessel was due at 11 the following morning. We had one more night. We spent the day breaking camp down to essentials and stacking everything above the tide line where a boat crew could load it fast. Work is good for people who are frightened. Everybody worked hard, and by mid-afternoon we had the whole site reduced to 3 tents, 1 fire, and a pile of dry bags under a tarp. Around 4, Monica came and found me while I was coiling line, and she stood there and did not say anything for long enough that I stopped what I was doing. She said, "That is not Sean." I asked her what she meant. She said, "He has not blinked since breakfast." I told her that was not possible. I told her that she was exhausted and frightened, and that the human eye cannot do that. She said, "I know. I have been watching him for 6 hours. Watch him." So I watched him. I sat by the fire for 40 minutes, and I watched Sean Henderson coil a rope and check a strap, and drink from a bottle, and talk to Kenneth about tide tables. He blinked. He blinked plenty. He blinked at the right frequency, roughly every 4 to 6 seconds, and I felt the tension come out of my shoulders. And then Kenneth said something funny, and everybody laughed. And in the moment of the laugh, Sean's face did the correct thing. The eyes creased and the mouth opened and the head went back, and it all happened in the right order. Just slightly too slowly. A quarter of a second behind everyone else. A quarter of a second is nothing. A quarter of a second is the difference between a man laughing and a man watching 4 other people laugh and then producing a laugh. I got up and I walked down to the water, and I was sick into the gravel. Danielle came down and stood beside me and did not touch me, and she said, "You saw it." I asked her how long she had known. She said, "Since 2:30 yesterday morning." We made a plan. It was a bad plan, and it was the only one we had. We would say nothing, do nothing, change nothing. We would keep the fire high. We would get through one night. In the morning the boat would come, and there would be a crew of 3 professionals with a radio and a diesel engine, and whatever this was, it would not follow us onto the water in daylight in front of witnesses. We told Diane and Monica and Edward. We did not tell Kenneth, because Kenneth could not lie, and everybody who knew him knew it. Edward listened to all of it, and then he asked one question. He asked whether anyone had seen Sean Henderson eat. Diane said he had eaten 2 packets of oatmeal at breakfast. Edward asked if anyone had watched him swallow. Nobody had. We sat up, all 7 of us, together, around the fire, all night, by unspoken agreement, and nobody suggested going to bed. Sean sat with us. Sean was pleasant company. He asked Diane about her grandchildren and listened to the answers. At around 3 in the morning, Diane Coleman stood up and said she was going to get another jacket from the tarp. I said, "Take somebody." She said, "It is 12 feet away, and you are all looking at me." And she was right. It was 12 feet. The tarp was inside the ring of firelight. I could see the whole of it. She walked over, and she knelt down, and she put her hand under the edge of the tarp, and she stopped. She stayed like that, kneeling, one arm under the tarp, her back to us, absolutely still. I said her name. She turned her head and looked back at us over her shoulder, and her face was wrong in a way I have never been able to describe to anybody. It was fear, but it was fear that had been going on for a long time, hours of it compressed into one look, and she had only been kneeling there for 4 seconds. She said, in a completely level voice, "Do not come over here." And then something under that tarp pulled her under it. There was no noise. That is the thing that has ruined me. A woman of 56 years and 150 pounds went from kneeling in firelight to gone in less than a second, and the tarp did not tear, and the gear under it did not scatter, and there was no scream, and no impact, and no sound of any kind except the fire. Kenneth went for her. Of course he did. Kenneth Jenkins was 61 years old, and he covered that 12 feet before any of the rest of us were on our feet, and he took hold of the tarp with both hands, and he threw it back. There was nothing under it. Dry bags, a stove box, 2 paddles, no Diane, no opening. Nothing behind it but 8 feet of gravel, and then the moss, and then the trees. Kenneth stood there with the tarp in his hands, and he screamed her name into the tree line. And her voice answered him from about 40 yards inside the trees. It said, "Kenny, I am here. I am all right. I am just turned around." Edward Barnes shouted at him. I have never heard anything like it before or since, an old man's voice going up into a register that tore something in his throat. He shouted, "Kenneth, count the faces." And Kenneth, God help him, turned around and counted us. I watched him do it. I watched him look at each of us in turn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then he looked back at the trees, and his face went to pieces, because 6 was all there was, and Diane was not among us, and the 6th was Sean Henderson standing at the fire, with his hands at his sides, perfectly still, not looking at the trees at all. Diane's voice called again. It said, "Kenny, please." Kenneth Jenkins dropped the tarp and walked into the trees. Edward went after him 3 steps, and I got both arms around Edward's chest from behind, and I held on. And he fought me, a 70-year-old man. And he was so much stronger than he had any right to be. And Danielle got in front of him and put both hands on his face and said his name over and over until he stopped. We did not hear Kenneth again. Not a shout, not a struggle, not one thing. The moss takes sound. 40 yards in that country is 40 miles. We stood at the edge of the firelight for 11 or 12 minutes, and the only sound in Glacier Bay was our own breathing and the fire and the water on the gravel. Then, from inside the trees, something started laughing. It was Kenneth's laugh, that big, loud restaurant laugh that turns strangers around. It went on for a long time, and it went up and down the scale, and it did not stop for breath, because it did not need to. Monica Perry put her hands over her ears and sat down on the gravel and rocked. The thing that was standing by our fire, wearing Sean Henderson's body, turned its head toward the trees, and it opened its mouth, and it laughed too, the exact same laugh, the same one, in perfect unison with the trees, for 9 or 10 seconds, 2 of them making one sound. Then both stopped at the same instant, and it turned its head back and looked at the 3 of us who were still standing, and it said, in Sean's voice, with Sean's easy carelessness, 5 hours until the boat. It was the first time it had lied badly. It was 4 hours and 10 minutes until the boat, and every one of us had been counting. 4 hours and 10 minutes. I want to tell you that we did something clever. We did not. There was nothing clever available. What we did was this. Edward took the axe and stood with his back to the fire. Danielle, Monica, and I got the 3 of us into one tent, and we left the fly door open so we could see out, and we put every remaining piece of driftwood on the fire at once, so that it burned tall and stupid and fast, and we did not speak, and we did not answer anything. The thing wearing Sean stood at the edge of the light and did not come closer. For 4 hours it talked to us. It used Diane's voice, and it used Kenneth's voice, and after a while it used the voices of people who were not on that trip at all. It used my mother's voice. My mother has been in the ground since 2009. It used her voice, and it called me by the name she used, and it asked me why I would not come and help her up. And I lay in that tent with my fist against my own mouth, and I did not answer. Around 5 in the morning it stopped talking, and it started counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Over and over, in Sean's voice, slow and patient, out there in the gray light. It had been listening to me for 5 days. It had learned the shape of the thing I did, and it gave it back to me, and that is when I understood what Edward had meant about it not being an animal. At 6:40, we heard the engine. It came up the arm from the south, and it was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard in my life, a diesel working hard against the tide, and Danielle was out of that tent and standing on the gravel waving both arms above her head before I had my boots on. The thing at the edge of the light stopped counting. It turned and it walked into the trees, unhurried, exactly the way the wolf had walked on the first night. And the moss took it, and that was the last any of us saw of it. The crew were 3 men off a Park Service vessel, and they were on the beach in under 6 minutes. I told them what I could. I told them we had lost 2 people, and that a third was not what he appeared to be, and that I understood how that sounded. The man in charge did not argue with me, and did not humor me. He put the 4 of us on that boat first, and he sent his 2 crew up the beach with a shotgun and a radio, and they came back in 9 minutes and said the tracks went into the moss, and they were not following them. We were on the water by 7:15. Glacier Bay went by on both sides, flat and gray and silent, doubling the mountains, and none of the 4 of us said one word for 2 hours. Here is what the record says. Diane Coleman and Kenneth Jenkins are officially listed as missing, presumed drowned, in the lower West Arm. There were 9 days of searching, 2 vessels, a helicopter, and a shore team with dogs. The dogs would not go past the tree line. That is in the report. It is phrased as failure to establish scent, but I talked to the handler afterward in a bar in Gustavus, and he told me that his dog, a 6-year-old shepherd he had worked for 4 years, laid down flat on the gravel at the edge of that moss and would not get up, and that he carried her back to the boat in his arms. Sean Henderson is also listed as missing, because Sean Henderson was never on that boat. We got to Bartlett Cove, and the crew counted us off, and there were 4 of us. Me, Danielle Ross, Monica Perry, Edward Barnes. I would have sworn on anything you care to name that I watched him step over the gunwale. Danielle would have sworn it too. Monica was certain she had sat across from him for the first hour. 4 of us stepped off that boat. They found his kayak 6 weeks later, upside down in a rock cleft 11 miles north of where we camped, in a place the tide does not reach. I have not been back to Alaska. Danielle sold her equipment and moved to Vermont and photographs weddings now. Monica went back to work and we exchange messages twice a year and neither of us ever refers to it directly. Edward Barnes died in his daughter's house in Juneau 14 months later, of a thing that had been in his chest for a long time before that trip, which he had known about and had told nobody. His daughter called me. She said he had left an envelope with my name on it. Inside was 1 sheet of paper with 4 lines on it, in an old man's handwriting. It borrows what it has been near. It cannot be first, it answers. It is curious before it is hungry. When it stops being curious, count the faces. I keep it in a drawer. I moved to a town in the Cascades with about 1,100 people in it, and I have a small house with a good porch light, and I sleep with the window open in summer because I am not going to let it take that from me too. Last August, a wolf came out of the tree line behind my property at dusk and stood in the gap between 2 firs and looked at my house for a while. I sat on my porch, and I did not move and I did not speak, and I did not go inside, because going inside would have been an answer, and after 11 minutes it turned around and went back into the trees on 4 legs, the way it should. I have not counted anything since. That is not true. I counted that night. I counted it, and there was 1 of it, and there was 1 of me, and the numbers came out even, and I sat on that porch until the sun came up. If you are out there in country like that this summer, and you have a fire, and somebody you love calls to you from just past where the light stops, I am not going to tell you what to do. I will only tell you that Kenneth Jenkins was the best man on that beach, and he went because he was, and that is the whole trick of it. Count the faces first.